But there was a reason why Marie found it against the grain to come away from the table where the Christmas presents were laid out, and this was that she had just noticed something there she had not observed at first. Fritz's hussars having taken ground to the right at some distance from the tree in front of which they had previously been paraded, there became visible a most delicious little man who was standing there quiet and unobtrusive, as if waiting patiently till it should be his turn to be noticed. Objection, considerable objection, might perhaps have been taken to him on the score of his figure, for his body was rather too tall and stout for his legs, which were short and slight. Moreover, his head was a good deal too large, but much of this was atoned by the elegance of his costume, which showed him to be a person of taste and cultivation. He had on a very pretty violet hussar's jacket, knobs and braid all over, pantaloons of the same, and the loveliest little boots ever seen on a hussar officer, fitting his little legs just as if they had been painted on them. Oh, it was funny. It's certainly that, dressed in this style as he was, he had a little rather absurd short cloak on his shoulders, which looked almost as if it were made of wood, and on his head a cap like a miner's. But Marie remembered that Godpapa Drosselmeyer often appeared in a terribly ugly morning jacket, and with a frightful-looking cap on his head, and yet was a very, very darling Godpapa. As Marie kept looking at this little man, whom she had quite fallen in love with at first sight, she saw more and more clearly what a sweet nature and disposition were legible in his countenance. Those green eyes of his, which stuck perhaps a little more prominently out of his head than was quite desirable, beamed with kindliness and benevolence. It was one of his beauties, too, that his chin was set off with a well-kept beard of white cotton, as this drew attention to the smile which his bright red lips always expressed. "Ah, Papa dear," cried Marie at last, "whose is that most darling little man beside the tree?" "Well," was the answer, "that little fellow is going to do plenty of good service for all of you. He's going to crack nuts for you, and he is to belong to Louise just as much as to you and Fritz." With which Papa took him up from the table, and on his lifting the end of the wooden cloak, the little man opened his mouth wider and wider, displaying 2 rows of very white, sharp teeth. Marie, directed by her father, put a nut into his mouth, and nut! He had bitten it in 2, so that the shells fell down, and Marie got the kernel. So then it was explained to all that this charming little man belonged to the Nutcracker family, and was practicing the profession of his ancestors. "And," said Papa, "as friend Nutcracker seems to have made such an impression on you, Marie, he shall be given over to your special care and charge, though, as I said, Louise and Fritz are to have the same right to his services as you." Marie took him into her arms at once, and made him crack some more nuts, but she picked out all the smallest, so that he might not have to open his mouth so terribly wide, because that was not nice for him. Then Sister Louise came, and he had to crack some nuts for her too, which duty he seemed very glad to perform, as he kept on smiling most courteously. Meanwhile, Fritz was a little tired after so much drill and maneuvering, so he joined his sisters and laughed beyond measure as the funny little fellow who, as Fritz wanted his share of the nuts, was passed from hand to hand, and was continually snapping his mouth open and shut, Oh, Fritz gave him all the biggest and hardest nuts he could find, but all at once there was a crack, and 3 teeth fell out of Nutcracker's mouth, and his lower jaw became loose and wobbly. "Ah, my poor darling Nutcracker!" Marie cried and took him away from Fritz. "Nice sort of chap he is," said Fritz. "Calls himself a Nutcracker. Can't give a decent bite. Doesn't seem to know much about his business. Hand him over here, Marie. I'll keep him biting nuts if he drops all the rest of his teeth and his jaw into the bargain. What's the good of a chap like him?" "No, no, no," said Marie in tears. "You shan't have him. My darling Nutcracker. See how he's looking at me so mournfully, showing me his poor sore mouth. You're a hard-hearted creature. You beat your horses, and you've had one of your soldiers shot." "Those things must be done," said Fritz, "and you don't understand anything about such matters. But Nutcracker's as much mine as yours, so hand him over." Marie began to cry bitterly and quickly wrapped the wounded Nutcracker up in her little pocket handkerchief. Papa and Mamma came with Drosselmeyer, who took Fritz's part, to Marie's regret. But Papa said, "I have put Nutcracker in Marie's special charge, and as he seems to have need just now of her care, she has full power over him, and nobody else has anything to say in the matter. And I'm surprised that Fritz should expect further service from a man wounded in the execution of his duty. As a good soldier, he ought to know better than that." Fritz was much ashamed, and troubling himself no further as to nuts or Nutcrackers, crept off to the other side of the table, where his hussars, having established the necessary outposts and vedettes, were bivouacking for the night. Marie got Nutcracker's lost teeth together, bound a pretty white ribbon taken from her dress about his poor chin, and then wrapped the poor little fellow, who was looking very pale and frightened, more tenderly and carefully than before in her handkerchief. Thus she held him, rocking him like a child in her arms, as she looked at the picture books. She grew quite angry, which was not usual for her, with Godpapa Drosselmeyer, because he laughed so, and kept asking how she could make such a fuss about an ugly little fellow like that. That odd, peculiar likeness to Drosselmeyer, which had struck her when she saw Nutcracker at first, occurred to her mind again now, and she said with much earnestness, "Who knows, Godpapa, if you were to be dressed the same as my darling Nutcracker, and had on the same shining boots, who knows whether you mightn't look almost as handsome as he does?" Marie did not understand why Papa and Mamma laughed so heartily, nor why Grandpapa Drosselmeyer's nose got so red, nor why he did not join so much in the laughter as before. Probably there was some special reason for these things.